So when you ask, how do we navigate these times? One of the things Jesus said to us was, how can you determine the signs of the weather but not pay attention to the sign of the times? And I think we have to really ask, what is the voice of God saying to us now? And how do we hear the voice of God?
Reaching from way down here. From way down here.
Welcome to Thread, a podcast designed to explore God's story and lead you into a full life in Christ.
Thank you for joining us in this conversation, co-hosted by myself, Hannah D'Souza, and Dr. David Proctor.
Though I'm way down here, I get a better view of this boundless world that I'm going.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Thread. We are starting a new series this week called God's People Returned. And this first episode, episode 42, will be about life in exile. And I am in London, so that's why I have a slightly different background. I'm also borrowing my mum's headphones, so I can't laugh too hard at your jokes, Dave, because they will fall out.
Oh, yes,
They
because
are
I do
hanging
bring
on.
the jokes. There are the
You
jokes.
too.
Yeah.
So don't be offended.
All right. Not laughing too hard. No, it's good to be back. We're now entering this kind of last era of the Old
Right.
Testament. So these 5 episodes really bring us to the end of the Old Testament. And then we're going to have 2 episodes on the intertestamental period, which covers that kind of 400 years before Jesus. And then we'll start recording the Gospels. So that'll be fun. So let's frame where we are, just to remind people. I don't know how long of a break it's been for most people that are listening, but in our last episode, when we concluded the last series on God's People Divided, we talked about this life-altering experience of Jerusalem's fall and the burning of the temple. The year was 586 BC. Now, we learned that even though the northern tribes went into exile much earlier in 722 BC, we got to the south and we talked about these waves of exile, 4 different ones actually. But in that third wave in 586, there would be forever a shift in the way the Jews understood their faith, their understanding of Yahweh, and the way that they would function as a community. So today, we start there, and we're going to lean into this kind of life in exile. So the next 2 episodes in particular, this one, we're going to really discuss what life in exile came to mean, how it was transformative for them. And then in the next episode, we're going to address some of the prophetic voices during this time that gave language, framework, and interpretation to the experience. So we're going to explore these kind of critical 47 years when the Jews lived in a land not their own, under a king not their own, without a temple of their own.
So I know in our last series, we introduced the concept of exile, and you spoke about the 4 waves that took place. So how would you say this episode now is building on that previous episode?
Yeah, so that was really about the kind of process of exile. And you remember we defined the different ways of looking at exile. So exile was an action, a verb of this kind of being thrust out of their land. And what we're actually looking at now is one of the other definitions of exile, which is more of a noun. Now they are living in exile, right? So we addressed before that process. Now we're going to get into the specifics of what did it really mean to be in exile and how did that affect them? And they needed to be in arguably, I mean, this is a hard and sad reality, but they had to be in exile for a good period of time for those lessons to sink in. Just like we talked about the 40 years of Israel in the wilderness, they needed to be in the wilderness for those 40 years for those lessons to sink in. So we really get into some of that here. And the end of this period, of course, will be when the Persian king, Cyrus, conquers Babylon, and Babylon loses its superpower status. And he issues a decree that allows the Jews to return to Judah. And we'll get to that in this series. And that's when they go back and rebuild the temple and rebuild the wall And we're going to talk about the book of Esther and the role she played in all that. But anyway, that's where we're at.
Okay. And why did you specifically say 47 years?
Yeah, so of course, if there's 4 waves, we have to kind of figure out when do we count the start and when do we count the end of exile. So for some, 605 BC was the beginning of exile. For that second wave, the beginning of exile was 597. For the third wave, it was 586. And then there was, of course, a wave of 582. So it kind of just depends. I mean, we're kind of marking that 47 years as the fall of Jerusalem to the return from Cyrus of Persia when he allowed that.
Now, I had to put a cool fact in here when I saw you mentioning Cyrus. This is my nerd moment. You have yours with the tabernacle.
Okay.
But mine
right.
is related to my favorite artifact, which is currently in the British Museum, and it's called the Cyrus cylinder. It's a clay cylinder that was discovered in Babylon in 1879. And actually, a cylinder was a very typical form of royal inscriptions in this period, like late Babylonian. And it has inscribed on it, in Babylonian script, both Cyrus's conquest of Babylon in 539 BC, as well as the decree of King Cyrus that you just mentioned, that states on it that all the deported people, all the people in captivity could return to their homeland. And it's written in this cylinder. It's actually really moving to see it, I mean, physically, knowing what that decree would have meant to so many of the Jews seeing it. So it's cool when you see
that's an old cylinder
like that. It is a very old cylinder. But it's
wow.
faith, yeah, definitely boosts my faith when I see things like that.
I know, that's amazing. So yeah, we're going to look at this, and as you just identified and said, it's kind of all how you count it, because this is often also referred to as the 70 years of captivity. Of course, if you're counting from the first wave, it's the 70 years of captivity. So this time of life in exile for the Jews was a period of profound transformation, culturally, religiously, psychologically. So we're going to talk about some of the ways that's true. And I want to start using a framework that often gets used by scholars to really process both coming into the Promised Land, then the identity that the Jews had of themselves in Promised Land, and then exile and how that shifted. And it really comes down to these 3 key components of land, temple, and king. If you remember back when we were discussing the Israel in the wilderness, of course, they didn't have their own land. They were living in the wilderness. And they were moving towards this promise of the land. But God was very careful to make sure he didn't bring them too soon because they weren't ready. With temple, you remember, Yahweh was very happy to live in this tent. And David was the one who's like, no way, I can't live in this palace and have you in a tent. So he insisted that they build a temple, a permanent house. And of course, Yahweh said, no, but your son can build it. So Solomon built the temple. And then the king, again, Yahweh was resistant to the idea of king. Now, so you got to ask the question, why is there resistance to these things, right? And I think we start seeing that. Israel their identity got caught up in the fact that they had the land, that they had the temple, that they had the king. And when your identity and your security gets wrapped up in the wrong things, it distracts from that kind of covenantal security that was meant to be in Yahweh. And so what happens here is exile strips away the things that Israel wanted to put security in. So we'll start here by talking just about that cultural and religious impact. When you lose the land, think about what happens. So you're forced to relocate after the destruction of Jerusalem. They're forced to go to this foreign place, which they now have to adapt to an entirely different way of being and living, which means they lose also that connection to a place they call home. So this absence of their own homeland and this displacement really reinforces that this is not going to be over in a week or two, right? This is a significant shift, and they're going to have to lean in and process this reality. It also changes their social structure. I mean, in the Promised Land, in Israel, they were their own leaders. They built their own culture. Now they're displaced in a foreign culture in Babylon. Now they were allowed to live in community with each other and maintain some of their traditions. We do see many of them kind of settled in along the river, and they carried out, again, some of their own cultural pieces, but they had to kind of adapt to this new reality. They also, by being displaced from the land, had to shift the way they thought about their economic life. They were able to participate in agriculture and craft and commercial activities, but even though some of them had success, they had to integrate to a different society and still try to figure out how they held their identity. So just simply that shift of the land is a big deal.
I think about how hard it was even for me relocating from the England to America or England to Moldova for a time, and that disorienting feeling of not being around your familiar surroundings. So how much more I imagine this forced relocation, being in captivity, but then even that idea of not knowing if you'll ever get home again, and how terrifying that really must have been for them.
Yeah, I think it would have been, I mean, certainly really challenging, and as you just said, to not have a choice in it, you know, to not have a choice to go back home, certainly made this set in. So when we talk about the second piece, the temple, this was also, from a religious perspective, really challenging. So they had only really come to understand their relationship with God at this stage through temple worship. But with the destruction of the temple, the rituals were now impossible. So it led to what we start seeing in the exile is a greater emphasis on other things like prayer, studying adherence to the Torah or the law. We also start seeing scripture becoming much more prevalent and important. So a lot of scholars believe that the exile itself prompted the kind of codification and compilation of the Hebrew scriptures that we now have today to preserve their heritage. The other thing that losing the temple did is we see now the emergence of synagogues. So they're no longer going to Jerusalem to worship. They need local places to worship. And so the synagogue begins to emerge as a place of worship and study and community gatherings.
Yeah, I had a question about that, whether the Jews would have been permitted then to have a synagogue or commune to kind of practice their religion while in captivity. I'm sure it varied depending on where,
I think so. And I think it depends on the time. It depends on the area that they lived in. And a lot of this is now, this whole time is called the diaspora, when the Jews were dispersed around the world. And so there were some places where we see synagogues starting to sprout up, and other places I'm sure it would have been more difficult. But yeah, that's also probably very dependent on the situation that they were in. So this third piece, which is interesting, is now they have no king. They have no political autonomy. There's no one to fight their battles. They clearly have lost their battle. We'll get into that a little bit more when we talk about the prophets and how Babylon played a role in all this. But imagine how hopeless you would feel. Babylon was the global superpower. You are now enslaved and captive in Babylon, living in a place that, I mean, it doesn't appear like anything's going to topple Babylon. They were significantly powerful. So what gives you hope in that, right? If your hope is tied up in the land and the temple and the king. So rethinking the idea of community leadership becomes important. They're no longer able to think back on the way they understood the role of the priests and the king and the court and the way that they were structured. And so it forces something different. So I think there's just a lot to process there.
Oh, definitely. And actually, I've been reading a commentary on the Bible, and Richard Foster kind of sums up this idea of these elements that have been taken away or stripped away from the Jewish people with this quote here. He writes, the Jewish people are stripped of externals they had come to believe were the substance of their lives. And this is what we've just talked about, their king, their temple, their city, and their land. The people, unable to look to these externals, are left with what they can carry on their backs and hold within their hearts, mainly their sacred writings and their memories and customs. Retaining and refining these, they learn, much against their will, of the greatness and goodness of God, far beyond anything they had known before. They learn what they had long been told, that God is available to and totally sufficient for the individual heart devoted to him no matter what the circumstances. I love that quote. It reminds me a bit of the episode we did on wilderness too. It's another stripping away of externals and a time when you're really forced to depend on God.
Well, I think that's so much what exile was. It was exactly that. So you know, you look at wilderness as formative. I think exile becomes a time to kind of strip down and reform. So it's a great analogy. I think there's a lot of parallels there.
So I know we've spoken about the cultural and religious impact, but another part was psychological and emotional impact of exile. And I know we touched on in our last episode on the fall of Jerusalem, this idea of lament and grief. And definitely the exile was deeply traumatic, and we see that reflected in biblical texts like Lamentations and Psalms. And we're going to read a particular psalm here in 137, which the psalmist is literally sitting by the rivers of Babylon, even wondering, can we even sing the same songs we sang before in Israel? Can we sing the songs of Yahweh in a foreign land? And you really get the sense in this psalm that the reality of life in exile is setting in. And I'm sure there was probably even a sense of, has God left us? Or where is God now? And it says in verse 1 of Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, and there we wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs, and our tormentors asked for mirth, saying, sing us one of the songs of Zion. How could we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand wither. Let my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth, if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy.
Yeah, look at how connected they process their faith with the city of Jerusalem, with the temple. So that's a whole new reality to recreate. We can't even sing there. If we're not there. So this is a necessary breaking down that land and king and temple concept. And it was deeply emotional and psychological. I think it also starts really, they have to process identity issues. Despite the pressures to assimilate, we see the Jews really learning through this period to find their own distinct cultural and religious practices. So that becomes important, right? What does Judaism, what's it really about? How do we really hold to our traditions in a healthy way in this new space? The piece that I think would be really difficult, and this is where the prophets come in, is hope. Hope for some sort of restoration. And we see prophets that we'll get into in the next episode specifically, like Ezekiel and Isaiah and Jeremiah, offering messages of hope, envisioning a return to the land. So part of what's interesting about this is Yahweh's breaking the connection that they have, but he's still willing to restore them back to it. And so it's not like it's just, this is for your forever life. So we see that hope held back out by the prophets, and we'll get into that a lot in the next episode. So where I want us to go with the rest of our conversation is I want us to lean in on something that, again, our friend Walter Brueggemann talks about in his writing. So we've used Walter Brueggemann in many different places over this series, the whole Old Testament series. We talked about him a lot in Genesis. We talked about a book he wrote called The Prophetic Imagination that was really helpful for us. There's another book that he wrote called Hopeful Imagination that deals specifically with the prophets during this period. And one of the things he brings out, which is kind of a main theme that I think is really good way of framing this, is he looks at 586, this time of the fall of Jerusalem, and he talks about everything that happens after that as two movements, a movement of relinquishment and reception. In other words, the Jews are being forced to let go of certain things and to embrace other things. There's something new happening here. And they have to make a shift from a temple-centered worship to a Torah-centered worship, like we already talked about, right? So before the exile, worship was largely about the temple and sacrifices and that kind of religious expression of that ritual. But after the exile, and they not have a temple, it becomes about receiving a new way. Studying and observing Torah becomes central. Synagogues, as we talked about, originate during this period, and place of study and prayer and communal gathering in that synagogue space. But we also see an interesting development of a deeper conviction about monotheism. Now, what we witnessed a lot over the last couple hundred years of Israel is they struggled with polytheism. There was a lot of other gods being worshipped while they were supposedly in covenant with Yahweh. But the exile underscores the uniqueness of Yahweh, leading to this stronger emphasis and more of an exclusive monotheism for them as a people. So this kind of shift from a syncretistic approach to Yahweh being their one and only God, we start seeing emerge as well out of this period.
So why do you think monotheism became, I guess, emphasized in exile as opposed to the Jews being influenced by the polytheism of those around them, which seems to be their inclination always?
You're right. It's such a good question because they were surrounded by foreign gods. I mean, arguably in Israel, they were able to define their own boundaries and keep Yahweh as their God, and yet they gave in to this problem. And now they're actually living in a foreign place with other gods, and they find a way to find them. And I think it was them being forced to really double down on who they were as a people. What makes us different now? If we're living amongst the Babylonians, what makes us different? Oh, Yahweh makes us different. So there's an interesting, kind of, like I said, doubling down of that. We also start seeing this kind of redefinition of covenant here. So covenant had always been at play. We've been talking about covenant, this whole process. And yet covenant starts shifting to something less external and more internal. And we start seeing that language show up during this period. So the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile raised these theological questions about Yahweh's promises regarding land, temple, and king. And they're now having to relook at these theological questions differently. And the prophets like Jeremiah and Ezekiel specifically help them to reshape this, to understand that covenant doesn't have to be tied into those physical things. So we see passages, and maybe I can have you help here, Hannah. We'll look at first this one in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 34, that makes this not about the external, but the internal.
Yeah, it reads, "The days are surely coming, says the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. It will not be like the covenant that I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, a covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, says the Lord. But this is a covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, says the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. No longer shall they teach one another or say to each other, 'Know the Lord,' for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, says the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity and remember their sin no more."
Yeah, so Jeremiah carries this message from Yahweh to the people that this covenant and the way they've understood it is meant to be moved into more of an internal covenant, a covenant of the mind and the heart, a binding that is more relational And so we see that language really start to emerge during this period. And similarly with Ezekiel, if you want to read this other passage, Ezekiel 36 talks about a similar thing.
It says, "A new heart I will give you, and a new spirit I will put within you. And I will remove from your body the heart of stone and give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit within you and make you follow my statutes and be careful to observe my ordinances."
Think about how significant some of those statements are at this period in time, especially, right? Yahweh is going to be the one giving the new heart, transforming the inner life. Yahweh's taking an active role in changing them as a people from the inside, which is really powerful, right?
Yeah.
So this is no longer just about, I'm your God in this external sense, and you come and you offer sacrifices. This is going to start shaping the very nature of your inner spiritual self. And he even says, I will put my spirit within you. Of course, we can draw all kinds of connections to what that comes to mean. But this is where it's really during this period of time that language really starts taking shape from these exilic prophets. So we also start seeing this idea of their identity being tied up in, as we talked already about with scripture and the diaspora, them finding different ways of connection. And, when scholars look at the Old Testament, this period of time really was significant for the editing, compilation, development of, and canonization of what we now have as the Old Testament. So particularly these historical books like Joshua through Kings and the prophets, and we start seeing a lot of similar themes in these writings of judgment and hope and restoration. But that development happens a lot during this period of time. The diaspora concept of them being spread all over the place really also forces them to figure out what makes a Jew, right? So we start seeing things like circumcision and dietary laws and Sabbath observances become key markers of their identity in these different spaces.
It is amazing going through all of this, thinking about what the exile did achieve, actually. Even with that kind of, so much of the Old Testament being like even solidified, I guess, at this time, out of a need to really know who we are, to remember the stories, to pass them on, not lose kind of their uniqueness. And I know you mentioned before about that doubling down of who are we being important now they're in exile. And I can picture how it would have solidified for many Jews their religious identity now that they're in this environment where they are the minority. They're now faced with this question of whether they will continue their practices that they had before, even now, when it would be really tested. And I think about Daniel, who was one of the captors from Judah and brought to Babylon, and his decision to continue to pray 3 times a day facing Jerusalem, as was his custom, despite it now being against the law and carrying significant repercussions for him. And that was a test he had to face and decide, will I continue to practice my faith the way I did? But it makes me think also of just growing up in a Christian home where following God is encouraged and was encouraged, and you're going to church as a family, you're praying together before meal times, and kind of this is just how we live. But then I think about when I had to move to university and having to decide an environment that was really antithetical to faith, I would say, moving to London, living with people that were not religious in any way, and then deciding whether I would now continue those practices that began in childhood and beyond. But now in an environment where it was not popular or considered strange even. And I think that transition for me was where I remember feeling like, okay, this faith is actually my own. And I think that's probably true of all testing times. And that's a small comparison compared to exile. But I'm sure it was another testing time where they had to really consider, is this going to be my faith even now in an environment that is hostile to it?
Such a great point. That's and there's those moments in all of our lives that happens, right? And you see these moments, like when I get married, what's my faith going to be like now in this relationship? When I have kids, What am I going to be doing to raise my own children? And how will I pass the faith on if I care about my faith to them, as you identify moving away from home? But those do become moments of testing where we have to now own our own faith journey, which is really great point. The other thing that starts happening here is the concept of Messiah really starts coming, because now we've lost the Davidic monarchy, this kind of confidence in the king and what the king brings and the family line of David and all of that now turns into this more of a messianic hope, an expectation of this future king that will come to restore Israel, to rebuild temple, to establish God's kingdom again. And of course, we're going to get into all of that fulfillment and what we see in the Gospels soon. But again, that language and the echoes of a Messiah, the foreshadowing starts coming about in this period of time. So the question that I think we need to kind of process at the end of all of this important historical consideration is exile spirituality. What do we learn spiritually that applies today from this kind of exile reality? And I think it's important to start with the question of, what does exile teach us? What does exile teach us about Israel? Now, there's some tough lessons about what it teaches us, but I actually think there's some positive lessons too. What the tough lessons are: human beings in general have a strong proclivity to wander, right? I mean, we've seen that now from the history of Israel, from this whole process. They have a proclivity to get things wrong, to misunderstand, to misinterpret. I mean, over and over and over and over and over again. So we learn that about Israel. We learn that about ourselves. We learn that about people. And faithfulness is hard. What's fascinating about the Jewish people in general is the resilience, the toughness, the Jews are the longest standing monotheistic faith community on our planet. And exile and all that they've been through from exile onward, and yet we still have this people. It's my own heritage, right? My mother's side is 100% Jewish. And that speaks a lot to the resilience and the internal fight of staying connected in this covenant with Yahweh, which I think is important. But we also have to ask the question, what does the exile teach us about Yahweh? This one is really, honestly, Hannah, I've been wrestling with this one as we've been preparing for this episode, because it's just so much bigger than you can sometimes get your head around. How is Yahweh still faithful to this covenant?
Yeah. I would have stopped by now.
Well, I think all of us as human beings would have stopped hundreds of years ago. There's just this dogged refusal to give up on Israel. And, our temptation are so many things. To punish, and there was punishment here, but punishment in love. Even exile, everything we're seeing here is to bring about change and transformation and to stay faithful and to bring them back to him. And it's all in love and for love, which we talked about in Wilderness. Everything that happens is in love and for love. But Yahweh refuses to give up on Israel, and he refuses to start over with another group of people, which to me is super powerful.
Yeah.
Right? So, key lessons there. So in so many ways, when I think of exile, there's so many parallels to today in the church. Things are not the same as we may have thought they were 50 years ago. Certainly, there's even a really significant book that was written called Faith in Exile that, for any that haven't read that book, I highly recommend it. I think it came out in 2019, but just equating this cultural phenomenon that we're in with exile, and there's so many perilous situations. But I think, even specifically with where our security lies and some of the things that I think we're wrestling with, certainly in the Western world, in our Western Christianity, but it's easy to become secure in the wrong things. So Israel became secure in the land and the temple and the king. Human beings tend to do the same thing. We put our security in the wrong things. We can put them in our nation. We can put them in leadership. We can put them in how we worship, what we believe. We put our security in our spiritual leaders. We put our security in being in the right church. I mean, all these different things. That sentiment played out certainly recently in elections. This kind of concept that you hear a lot about being God's country, God's nation, as if, certainly in America, as if there's some kind of, reestablished Israel now that God's people are here. And it's not right. It's not right to put security in those things. I think with leadership, how we can tend to tie in politics and faith, as if somehow political leaders are, these spiritual Messiah type figures, which again, it's the wrong place to put our security. Celebrity culture, and even in church leadership, putting security in who's your pastor, who's your church leader. So there's a lot there to think about.
So many parallels.
That's so
Too many parallels.
Well, and so then the question is, and I'm in conversations all the time in the academic world with what's happening with the church, capital C, global church. So many people leaving the institution of the church. So many churches closing their doors. So many new challenges that we're having to face and fight. And what does it mean? What does it mean, and how do we navigate these times? So, anyway.
Well, how do we, Dave? How do we navigate these times? Or even how does all of this apply to us still? Obviously, this was a unique time, exile, that we've talked about. There are many parallels for our own time. What should we take from this?
All right, so I got a crazy story to tell you that happened to me a few weeks ago, and I think maybe this is, to me, a big part of what we have to take out of this. But so I'm recovering from a total knee replacement, and I've been trying to get back out on my bike, and I went out a couple weeks ago to go on this bike ride. Now, to access the park, in which is the mountain bike park, I have to ride on the streets to get there. It's like 3 miles to get down there. So I'm on my bike, I'm on the street, and I pull up to this really busy intersection. And it's one of those intersections where you've got 2 lanes going every direction. So there's 8 lanes of traffic moving. And when I get to the intersection, no one's moving. And there's this one horn honking. And I pull up to the stoplight and I look out, and there is a deaf man with his cane walking diagonally through this intersection. Okay?
Wow.
And no one's helping him. And I start yelling, "Sir, follow my voice. Walk towards my voice." And he immediately locks into my voice and starts moving through this intersection straight towards me. Okay?
Wait,
So
is he deaf or blind?
I said he was deaf. He was blind.
He did. Okay, I was like, how did he hear you?
Oh man. Okay.
That's
well,
amazing.
so
he locks into your voice.
so he's blind. He's using his thing. He locks into my voice. He follows me through this intersection. He comes up on the curb, and I'm like, I'm just in awe, right? So I said,
Yeah.
"Are
my
you
goodness.
okay?" And he goes, "Oh, I'm fine." I go, "Do you know where you are? Do you need help getting somewhere?" And he goes, "I'm just out for a walk, and I'm good." And he
my
just
goodness.
starts carrying on. But I go through the intersection on my bike, and I cannot stop thinking about this. I can't stop thinking about 2 things. First of all, the courage that this man had to boldly go out on a walk without being able to see, but how quickly he locked into my voice that could have, this may be a little over dramatic, save his life. I mean, he was walking through 8 lanes of traffic. 8 lanes of traffic. And then I'm fascinated, secondly, by the fact that no one got out of their car, right? You just got this one person who's irritated and honking their horn. But what it makes me think about when I'm leave is how important it is to hear the voice calling you. So when you ask, how do we navigate these times? One of the things Jesus said to us was, how can you determine the signs of the weather, but not pay attention to the sign of the times? And I think we have to really ask, what is the voice of God saying to us now? And how do we hear the voice of God? Because hearing the voice of God is going to help us navigate this new reality. If we just go back to the way things have always been and try to double down on previous ways, I think we're going to have a real difficult time navigating the new reality that we're in. So what this means is it moves us into a mature both and paradigm. I don't think we've talked about the both and concept before, have we?
Maybe share it and then I'll see.
Okay. Well, when you move into maturity, you're constantly seeing things new. You're seeing things that have been neglected. You're coming to recognize, wait a minute, what if we had done this differently? So, and as an example, we've talked a lot about spirituality in this podcast, the focus on the lived experience and how we posture ourselves in the world. Now, the both and paradigm would say yes to spirituality, but it doesn't mean we reject theology. We have to hold on to the things from our past while building into the new things that God is revealing through his voice and through his spirit. As Jesus said, we have to practice the latter without neglecting the former. So I think, for example, we've become so individualistic as a society. And one of the great things missing in maturity that we've got to move into, that Exile teaches us about, is the need for community. But that doesn't mean we neglect individual commitment, right? We've got to hold on to individualism and embrace community. One of the other big ones is, I've seen a lot of churches say, okay, focusing too much on the mission has been detrimental to the spiritual health of our church. And I agree, right? So we need to focus more on justice and spiritual formation and all of those things that have been neglected, but not to exclude mission. It's the both and paradigm. And I think maybe one last one for us to consider that I see happen in a lot of churches today is leadership. There has been toxic leadership and authoritative leadership and unhealthy leadership paradigms in a lot of churches. And so there's a reaction in a lot of churches that we just need to collaborate and be a team and use gift-based approaches. And I 100% agree with all those things, but not to the exclusion of leadership. So the question in how do we navigate times when we're moving into this exile, this disorienting time, is we don't let go of what we've known, but we have to add what God is teaching us now in our maturing process.
We have to hear his voice as we cross the 8 lanes of traffic.
That's exactly
hear him
right.
guiding us. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So anyway, I know, we've talked about a lot of things here today, but I think to leave us here with this idea, spiritually, when we're in these times of exile that tend to be disorienting, how do we hear the voice of God? How do we embrace the both and paradigm? So how do we accept what we're learning now without rejecting and bashing our own past, right? Because our past brought us to where we are, good, bad, and ugly, and there's good in it. But we've got to really evaluate that. So the Jews didn't abandon their faith. They embraced new aspects of their faith and new realities of their faith in this new situation that they were in. So we're going to jump in next time to these voices. What I love about this next podcast is we're going to talk about these voices that give structure and interpretation to the exilic experience. So the experience itself teaches us some things, but we need voices of spiritual reason and guidance that help us understand how are we supposed to interpret what's happening. And that's what we're going to start seeing in that next episode. So
we have that to look forward to.
we have that to look forward to.
We do. We need some hope. Voices of hope. They're coming.
There will be voices of hope. So great. Well, we will see you, Hannah, next episode. Episode 43, Prophets in Exile.
Exilic.
Prophets in Exile. Prophets
I think it's exilic
during the
prophet-
exile. We'll have to figure out what
prophets.
to call that, but we'll see you next time.
Okay. See you, everyone.
Thank you for joining this Thread conversation.
We're more than a podcast. Check out threadpodcast.org for more immersive content.
Though I'm way down here, I get a better view of this boundless world that I